Hello. So it looks like we are nearing the end of this course, and what I have planned for the next few lectures is that we are going to try and synthesize some of the themes that we've been speaking about and also to look at how they speak to some of the contemporary challenges of our times. In that spirit, today's lecture is on urbanization. So this is the perspective series, you can say, for the next few lectures, except for the immediate next one, which would be a tutorial. But pretty much most of the lectures in the coming week are in the perspective series. And today I start with speaking about perspectives on urbanization. In the next week, we go on with perspectives on climate change, perspectives on infrastructure. Like I said, some of those themes which are central to the way we understand our contemporary world. So with that, let's start with perspectives on urbanization. We started off this course with looking at the changes that were going on in Western Europe as it was industrializing and as capitalism became the major mode of production. Right. So one can say that the classical sociologists were all responding to that particular moment in time and in space. With Marx, we saw how he wrote about cities as places where there is class conflict between the bourgeoisie and the working classes. With Durkheim, he was trying to understand how social solidarity is maintained despite difference, despite the division of labor. And Weber wrote about the institutionalization, the bureaucracy that formed the basic structures of the urban and came along with the capitalist mode of production. So this was like late 1800s, early 1900s. This was the kind of social theory that we saw emerging in the context of the urban. Well, then in the 1920s, around the 1920s, we see urban ecology, especially coming from the Chicago School of Urbanism, the work of Robert Park, who looked at the city as in the language of biology and ecology. So using terms like competition, succession, invasion, and with Ernest Bourget's concentric model of the Chicago city, showing how migrants move through the city as an ecological process. A lot of the Chicago School work was not abstract in the sense that the earlier sociologists were, like Marx was writing from what he was observing around him, and as was Durkheim and Weber, but this was very much field oriented. So ethnographic studies, large surveys, both quantitative and qualitative analysis of the cities that these scholars inhabited formed the basis of urban ecology, and in the late 1920s or so. Then in the 1960s, this was a period we have seen of great ferment, of a lot of conflict in the context of the city. We see the work of Henri Lefebvre, the notion of right to the city, cities as conflict zones, as places which are contested, as space which is produced. We also, towards the 1980s, see David Harvey speaking to us about time-space compression, about the, again, the right to the city, about the urban revolution. So those kind of works on urban social theory are emerging at that period in time. Largely political economic approaches, also radical approaches to understanding the city. The late 1990s and early 2000s see the emergence of scholarship that looks at the idea of the world city. So that certain cities such as New York, London and Tokyo are positioned as command centers, as up in the hierarchy. So there's a certain hierarchy that emerges of the city. There's the global city, there is the world city, and there are debates on globalization and what it is doing to urbanism and the kind of urbanism that is emerging in the context of a very, very interconnected world. Then around 2000, only 2010, we see a lot of post-colonial scholarship and theories on southern urbanism emerging. We've spoken about this in just the previous lecture, but I also want to bring attention to two other works that I think are relevant here. One is Jennifer Robinson's Ordinary Cities, and in this she challenges the notion of the world city and argues that when we look at cities in a hierarchical model, such as there is the world city, which is somehow exemplified as a model, and then the others are peripheral cities or catching up cities. And then when we see urban theory as that which is centered around New York, London, Chicago, Tokyo, and then the rest of the city appear to be just providing data. So she critiques that, and she says that all cities are ordinary cities, and all cities make a productive contribution to social theory. So that is the central argument of Ordinary City. Another important work that emerges around this time is Ananya Roy's Poverty Capital. This work links in a large extent work emerging from work on Southern theory, but also debates on globalization. She draws on the understanding of capitalism as ever expanding, and then argues that the newest frontier of capital is poverty itself. And she does this by showing how microfinance, by developmental organizations, by international organizations, NGOs, benefit from and profit from their studies and their approaches towards supposedly eliminating poverty. So poverty becomes the new capital. Her book is titled Poverty Capital, and she very nicely shows how poverty capital is entrenched in the global flow of capital itself. Along with that, several other works emerges in just the next lecture, where I will introduce the tutorial to you. I will speak to you about Southern urbanism and the emerging vocabulary and theory around looking at the city from the global south. Then in the 2010s and 2020s, we get scholarship, that especially from scholars like Neil Brenner, that look at the whole world as an interconnected city. So the idea of planetary urbanization, the idea that cities are now no longer isolated pockets. In fact, they are spread around the globe, and also areas that may not classify as the urban, such as the rural or hinterland, or are so intricately connected to the urban that the urban condition affects the whole planet. So that's the idea of planetary urbanization. Now, if you see, all of these theories are speaking to the particular time and space that they are coming out of, and they are doing the task of abstracting theory out of understandings of how capital moves, how urbanization progresses, and so on. But there's another aspect to urbanization that I want us to look at, and that is looking at the city as something that can be sensed, as something that has a certain aesthetic, as a sensibility, something that has rhythms of its own. And of course, in those rhythms, there can be inequality such that a particular social class might be allowed to make noise, whereas the noise of other social classes is not tolerated. The pollution generated by one kind of source, such as automobiles, is tolerated, versus those industries that might employ a lot of working class populations may not be tolerated. So there are these inequalities, but there are also ways, sensory ways of sensing the city, of feeling the city, the dust in the city, the pollution in the city, seeing the aesthetics of the city, listening to the sounds of the city, the music that emerges from the city. What kinds of music does a city enable and encourage? So in order to do that, and I think this is really new work, I have invited Srijay Sutar, whom you've met before. He is the TA for this course and is a doctoral candidate at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Mohali, in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. And he will be talking to us at the intersection of ethnomusicology and urban theory. So welcome, Srijay.
Hi everyone. In today's lecture, we will be taking a look at the field of ethnomusicology from an urban perspective. So ethnomusicology, if we go into the etymology, ethnos means people and musicology means the study of music. So ethnomusicology is a study of music in its social and cultural context. Ethnomusicology emerged from comparative musicology by shifting its focus from the colonial classification of other, of exotic musical objects to be looked outside of the West to the study of music as a living, socially embedded practice. Although until the 50s, it did retain some of the foundational power imbalances in the field until a more Marxist and decolonial perspective came that exposed that there is also a very there is also a need to study music in its material conditions and also to analyze the relations between the different means of production. So the Frankfurt School, for example, we know from our previous classes, provided a critical framework, a critical language in studying how the culture industry transforms things like music, films, theater into a standardized commodity, right? That promotes this passive consumption. So I want to propose and present a specific sub-branch of ethnomusicology called urban ethnomusicology. So I want to recognize the urban as not just a backdrop, but as a precondition for its very existence. Why the urban? Because the city is actually where the commodity form exists in its highest density, right? It is in the urban space that forces of consumption, reproduction, and production exist, and they're concentrated in a very high density. So it is in this urban space we see concert halls, we see musical bands, we see radios, we see DJs, we see digital platforms, and all these things. Furthermore, the city is also the realm where music transforms most explicitly from a use value to an exchange value. In, let's say, a pre-capitalist or rural setting, music might function as something of having a social value. Music might function as a use value. It may be sung, it may be ritualistic, it can be communal. But as soon as music is entering the urban marketplace, it is packaged, it is produced, it is marketed, it is sold. We see the rise of the music industry where the listener becomes the consumer and the musician becomes a worker. Adorno would actually call the singer or the musician as puppets of the bourgeoisie. Gramsci would probably call them organic intellectuals, bridging the gap between the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois interest and the working class by selling the culture industry. So as we begin, we must hold this dialectic in mind that ethnomusicology cannot study music in vacuum. It must also study the urban as the site of commodity fetishism, where social relationships between musicians and audiences, between different groups of people, is actually obscured by a very surface level enjoyment of a melody or a rhythm or a song. So let's revisit Frankfurt School and look at Adorno and Horkheimer, who gave us the language to discuss and critique the culture industry. So they understood that under capitalism, culture is no longer autonomous. They identified the culture industry as a system where art is no longer autonomous. It is stripped of its critical edge. It is standardized for mass production. It is formulated and it is used as a tool by the bourgeoisie, by the ruling classes for social control. For instance, why do most of the songs we listen to have similar durations? Why do they all have similar chord progressions? Why do they all have similar structures? So what really is a musical taste is the question Adorno is asking. So he calls this phenomenon pseudo-individualism. We might think that you and I have different musical tastes, but in essence, it's the same cultural logic that is making both of us pick really similar music that we think is different, and that is only an illusion, is what Adorno is arguing. Adorno himself was a musicologist, and he helps us to see the phenomenon of regressive listening, and that, he says, is a product of this commodity fetishism, where the listener is no longer engaging with the structure, the metaphor, the meaning of the music, but is only actually consuming a fetishized object, a fantasy. It is consuming the celebrity, the brand, the hit song, the conductor, the soloist. Adorno would also argue that in this urban realm of consumption, the listener is quite alienated from their own musical sensibilities and abilities. So he says in his essay, the listener is converted along his line of least resistance into the acquiescent purchaser. However, we must also acknowledge the limitations of the Frankfurt School, particularly from a decolonial and ethnographic perspective. The Frankfurt School theorists, for instance, have theorized from this position of elitism and European modernism. They looked at jazz cultures, for instance, also as a product of standardization and regression, which has been critiqued in the future, especially on Adorno's writings on jazz. So Adorno, for instance, was suspicious of jazz itself as a genre. He was suspicious of the spontaneity, of the improvisatory quality of jazz, and also the ability of jazz to be mass appropriated by different cultures. So he did not see a big subversive potential in the genre of jazz. The critique would be how Adorno, for instance, failed to often account for the agency of the oppressed. This sort of framework was always suspicious of body, of spontaneity, and it often failed to account for the agency of the oppressed. Now let's come to the global south, and in particular India, where there is a direct material correlation between caste, space, and the kind of music a community produces. To understand this, we must look at who actually owns the means of production, who controls the means of production in music making. Today we think of Indian classical music as ancient, as traditional, as timeless, but Janaki Bakle from her 2005 work shows us how this Indian classical music is actually inherently modern. It was born in the city. It is urban. It is very much urban, and she shows how what we now call Indian classical music was actually systematized. It was standardized. It was cleansed. It was classicized, canonized in the late 19th and 20th centuries by figures like V.N. Bhatkande and V.D. Paluskar. So this really happened in cities, in the urban, in cities like Bombay and Pune, under nationalist pressures. So the goal was to create a national music, an Indian music that could represent a unified India, one that was respectable, one that was scientific, one that was free from the taint of the Tawaif or the courtesans, and free from the feudal Muslim courts that had historically nurtured it. So this project, Bakle argues, was a part of a broader nationalist discourse. So this form of popular Indian classical music was actually here not created exactly directly by capitalism alone, but through forces of both capitalism, colonialism, and nationalism. It effectively erased the complex hybrid history, the syncretic history of the subcontinent, which had been shaped for centuries by interactions between different syncretic groups, traditionally in princely states, and what it led to was a purified modern urban art form that is actually not the classical we have in mind. So the ancient tradition that we think of is actually a modern tradition, a modern invention that was born right in the city. Another work by Pranati Divakar actually shows how two really different musical worlds divided along the lines of caste, one the Carnatic classical music and the other Ghana music, coexisted in the city of Chennai, and how spatialized along caste lines music can be. She shows how place identity comes to symbolize group differences, exacerbating social and spatial segregation. So this shows the cultural logics of Indian cities, of caste segregation, of colonial urban planning, and the peripheral transformations that also structure musical production very differently. Another article titled Music as an Anti-Caste Counterpublic by K. Kalyani in 2024 discusses the formation of an anti-caste counterpublic, an alternative cultural sphere created through performative practices that have historically served to recenter oppressed caste identities by contesting in the dominant public sphere and space. So these counterpublics are deeply intertwined with everydayness, emerging not from the formal politics, but very much from the everyday, from the everyday mundane acts of resistance that accumulate over time to time and cultivate an anti-caste consciousness among listeners and practitioners. So she documents various such groups working in India, forming a counterpublic in the dominant public sphere. However, this article also points out critical concerns about what happens to such counterpublics under forces like majoritarianism and forces like bourgeois nationalism that forces these communities under curtailment and surveillance. So the central question left open now is whether anti-caste counterpublics have withered away entirely or have they been relegated to a weak counterpublics. So now let's revisit Adorno, having the global south context in mind, and recall that for Adorno, subversive music was something that was autonomous, something that was difficult, something that refused popularity, something that stood apart from commercial culture, and it offered no easy pleasure or immediate political purpose. So for Adorno, political music, ironically, was something that served no political function. So he would say that collective singing, protest songs, mass mobilization, counterpublics were actually not subversive, but they were actually pseudo activities. They were an illusion of resistance that actually reinforced the same system. So he calls these systems as very easily co-optable by capitalism. And he said that true subversion actually lay in formal innovation, in changes in the form that resisted co-option. For example, he talks about the composer Schoenberg, who writes in really disruptive, tragic styles, in atonal styles, in dodecaphonal styles of music that was completely subversive. It was unexpected. The music was tragic. It was difficult to listen to. And that for him was true subversion through changes, through innovation in the form. For instance, think about the Super Bowl halftime show by Bad Bunny, or think about the Casteless Collective band in India. Adorno would argue that these forms of music are actually not subversive, that they are not subversive in the sense that they don't have a very different form from the music that exists in the culture industry. This facade of subversion, of being anti-capitalist through capitalism itself, is an illusion, and therefore this cannot be subversive. He says that popular music can actually never be used in protest. That would be a contradiction in terms, in ethics, in meanings. Although I do think that the articles I mentioned give a good critique of Adorno's framework by arguing that his framework is too narrow, is too Eurocentric. For instance, his demand for autonomy, for an innovative form, presumes a bourgeois public sphere, presumes a bourgeois public lifestyle where a so-called pure art can exist. And this, as several scholars have shown, can be a luxury for communities fighting oppressions like caste. So for Dalit communities, for instance, several scholars have shown that music that is accessible, that is collective, that is explicitly political, is not pseudo activity but a vital tool for reclaiming public sphere, for reclaiming public space. And they would argue that Adorno is mistaking collective listening as regression. For example, decolonial scholars would argue that he is failing to recognize that for communities systematically isolated by caste, class, gender, the very act of singing and performing together in public can be a profound act of subversion itself. So I will end this class here, and I urge you to think about the difference between music that resists by standing apart from the world and music that resists by going through it.